Welcome back to Champion News Talk Radio, brought to you by championnews.net. This is Carol Parisi. Our founder, Jack Roser, and myself have Charlie Kirk with us today, a recently high school graduated young man that is the founder of Turning Point USA. Turning Point USA. Right. And it was very interesting. Before the break, Charlie, you were talking about how the curriculum was established, so they layer this progressive message where they're making you read a book, and then they're talking about the Upton Sinclair book, The Jungle, and then they talk in another class of how wonderful the FDA is.
Right.
But clearly, back in the 1900s, refrigeration wasn't what it was. You did need some protection for the folks, because I'm sure there were people that could have been taken advantage of.
Right, well, it needs to be put in perspective.
Perspective,
right,
yes.
And it's not put in perspective. They make it seem like this is happening currently in Chicago, is the type of prose they put it forward. And of course, again, in the early 1900s, you said it perfectly, there was different standards. People were able to ingest food that had more germs back then. They had a more tolerant immune system than they did nowadays.
I know.
And they never tell you that.
They never tell you, well, it's antibacterial. We've
Exactly. Nobody washed their hands every day or at every meal.
A little bit of dirt is a good thing.
Back in the 30s in Chicago, there was a son of a rich man that got polio, and he was in an iron lung and much in the news. But oddly enough, the survey showed that people that came from well-to-do families got more polio than the poor people did. And it's very much what you're saying.
Right.
I think that's been pretty well established, that you develop a tolerance to bad environment, bad bugs and other things. Your body gets stronger.
And another example of how the literature lined up with the history I can use, you look at the early 1900s, there was a great, as they put it, conglomeration of wealth upwards. You know, you had Andrew Carnegie and Mellon, and you had, of course, Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. And then at the same time, you're reading books in literature class that talk about the affluence of the times, that talks about how people were very extravagant. You can name several examples. But what it does is it says, oh, all these rich people were enjoying themselves while the other people were working in meat shops and the FDA saved them. When in reality, you look at the economics of the time, the reality of it was like, look at The Great Gatsby. Everybody knows that story. You know, there was so much affluence in New York in the swinging 20s, and then they look at, you read a book about Grapes
of Wrath.
The Grapes of Wrath, that's right. And when everybody's suffering in the farms and there's a big dust bowl, they try to make that contrast intentionally, and then who saved the day? Oh, FDR did with all of his great government programs.
Let me ask you a question here. Anywhere in there did they talk about the $5 day that Henry Ford put in?
Never did they talk about the morality of Henry Ford, or how he implemented the assembly line, or how he raised the standard of living for millions of people.
Middle class.
A lot of people don't understand that Henry Ford was the greatest social reformer of the whole century.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I think it was 1913. He went, people were making $8. They worked 6 days a week. They were making about $8 a week. And Henry Ford jumped to a $5 day. Now everybody that worked for him, everybody around says, stop that foolishness. This is silly. He says, no. He says a working man should be able to buy the cars that he's building here.
Yes.
And that was a private sector.
Imagine he took them from
example.
$8 a week to $5 a day. That's from $8 to $30, I think.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how it's such a shining...
What a huge change.
And you look at from 1920, from the Great Depression start, you had more people owning televisions, increase radio, access to refrigerators, access to entertainment capital and movies. But what was demonized is when the rich were having fun in The Great Gatsby and the poor people were suffering in the farms. And why do they make it frame that way? Because it's a justification for our social programs.
It's called Saul Alinsky, who comes from Chicago.
Let's look into some other things out of that. You have this scene with our esteemed President Obama early on in his thing, saving. There were banks that were too big to let fail. They had indulged in buying things that were pretty much worthless, expecting to make great profits. Turned out not to be true, and they were going to go bust. So the government provided the money to rescue the banks on their bad investments. Well, how about Morgan around 1900?
That's right.
when the big bust came then,
He wrote the check.
he wrote the check. He took the big chances.
That's right.
He wrote the check. There's a phrase for that I didn't understand, but I read in the Wall Street Journal a few years back. It's the moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
If
right.
you take a big chance, you ought to, when you fall on your butt and crack your noodle, you ought to be the one that pays for it.
Right.
Not that. So who did Obama save? The richest sons of guns in the state were these wild bankers taking big chances and then
Right.
paying themselves big bonuses when they got. Who are the rich guys? They're the ones Obama's supporting.
Right, and also,
Who
I
are the
mean,
rich guys in politics? The Democrats. The Republicans are picking with the pigeons, for God's sakes, and Madigan is rolling in hundreds of millions of dollars.
that's right.
And yet people believe the crap that the press is putting out, that the Republicans are the rich guys. The hell they are. The Democrats are rich.
Right, and I think there was a study that the 8 richest counties in America, all of them swung Democrat.
Oh, that is pathetic.
Right, out of the 8 richest counties in America, and the high conglomeration of wealth. But also, to your point, another thing that isn't talked about in schools is the immorality of high debt.
You know what? We're going to be back. Stay with us right after the break.